Hi, this is Eric Settle, and I'm here with my co-host, Rafe D'Amico, for the first episode of Pinot and Policy. Hi, Rafe.
Hey Eric, how's it going?
We're good. So in Pinot and Policy, what we're going to be doing is a conversation between a boomer and a Gen Xer, talking about all the issues that are involved in politics, both locally and nationally, as well as an occasional conversation about wine, which is how we came up with that name, Pinot and Policy. It really came from an idea that started about a year ago when I was running for Attorney General of Pennsylvania, and Rafe was my campaign manager. And we started to want to have an opportunity to talk to people about the issues. And this name, which Rafe brilliantly came up to, um,
Thank you.
said, you know what? Let's call it Pinot and Policy. And so when the campaign was over and we said, what's next? We said, hey, you know what? Best thing about this campaign was the name of the program. So let's keep using that. Anyway,
And the best part is that it's I'm doing the dry January, so I don't even have any wine for this episode, Eric.
that's fair. So we'll make sure that come February, we'll be able to actually sample the wine.
Of course.
So in today's episode, we're going to talk about a couple things. We're going to talk about the Sixers stadium. We're going to talk about the LA wildfires. We're going to talk about decency in politics. And then we're going to talk about Trump.
Fun, fun, fun.
So let's start with the Sixers stadium. As everybody knows who covers sports and lives in Philadelphia or even nationally, yesterday, the 76ers announced that they, after a 2-year effort to put a stadium at Market East, they made a decision that instead they were going to build a new stadium in South Philadelphia, where the current stadium is and all the other sports teams play. As Rafe will remember, it was a big fight because where they wanted to put it was at Market East, which is adjacent to the Chinatown neighborhood of Philadelphia. And as has happened before, every time someone tries to build a downtown stadium or an entertainment complex, that particular neighborhood objects, and it becomes a real NIMBY problem.
Yeah, so it was interesting because I saw a lot of social media reaction to this decision, right? And you would think that this was one for the people, that like the protesters, quote unquote, had a victory here. The people's voice was collectively heard, and this caused the reversal of the decision. And while that seems really nice and romantic, I feel like there was a little bit more than meets the eye there as far as this being the will of the people.
Well, and Rafe, I think you're right. It turned out that the story seems to be that Josh Harris, who owns the 76ers, as well as the Redskins, I'm sorry, now the Washington Commanders, invited a group of people down to his Superbox at Northwest Stadium in D.C. And that included not only Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner, but Brian Roberts, CEO of Comcast.
So wait a minute, Eric. You mean this might not have just been done for the good of the people and the good of the city? That there might actually be a bottom line that's attached to this curveball that came at the last minute?
It did, and the interesting part is the involvement of Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner, who had just made a deal with Comcast to move the NBA back to NBC, where they were for many, many years. And so clearly the story was reported that Adam turned to Josh Harris and Brian Roberts and says, hey, you guys are fighting. This isn't cool for the league. And with that, suddenly a new relationship after these guys have been fighting for 2 years. I mean, what's really interesting about this battle in Philadelphia was you really had the most powerful people, fighting against each other. You had, the former CEO of Independence Blue Cross, Dan Hilferty, who now runs Comcast Spectacor, and Brian Roberts, the employer of the, biggest employer in Philadelphia and probably the most important corporate executive maybe in the history of Philadelphia, because Comcast has such a large national, international scope, that when you have those people battling against everybody else, it really was an interesting fight. And David Edelman and Josh Harris, they had a good idea, which was let's build our own stadium. Let's have our own control. And the twofer is let's help develop Market East, which has been a spot for as long as I've lived in Philadelphia, and that's about 50 years now on the Boomer. It's always been kind of a disaster.
And it's just been a desert, just a dearth of commerce and like a dead zone between Old City and City Hall, essentially, and further into the city, into Center City, into Rittenhouse.
Right. It's right. It's really. I mean, it's really I don't wanna say a blight, but it really is. You go from it was the Commerce Corridor for many years. Long before that was the Commerce Corridor, anchored by the John Wanamaker, now Macy's, now the going to be the closed Macy's across from City Hall. So it really. And I think, look, I think the idea of the gallery that was the first mall, and then the fashion district, which is the second mall, were ways to try to develop that area, and it just hasn't been very successful. So the idea of having a stadium there really was a good one.
Yeah, and I think, City Council and Mayor Sherelle Parker saw this as an opportunity to kind of kill two birds with one stone, right? They said, okay, well, not only can we get the Sixers a new stadium, take care of this problem that exists with one of the major four sports teams, but we could finally develop this area, bring some commerce to the city, maybe even do something along the way with public transportation to build out the area. But as you said, there was massive community backlash, especially from the Chinatown community. I think city councils, some of them are probably feeling like they were pawns in this dispute between the people that you just mentioned, which was ongoing for years. And like this move, when once Sherelle Parker really gave her blessing and city council approved it, I think it finally showed everybody that the Sixers were for real. They were serious. They were going to actually move out of the South Philadelphia area. Like they were also, I don't think anybody ever believed they were going to move to Wilmington, Delaware, but they were also considering Camden, which is a little bit more viable and realistic because that's where the Sixers have their practice facility. But this Center City option proved to be the most realistic and viable despite the community backlash. It's interesting how now you've got City Council and Mayor Sherelle Parker, with a little bit of egg on their face, but they're quickly backpedaling and saying, almost echoing everything that the proponents of keeping the 76ers back in South Philly and not going into the Chinatown neighborhood, well, really the adjacent Chinatown neighborhood. They were never actually going to build in Chinatown precisely, but it was the building in the adjacent neighborhood that was going to impact Chinatown in a significant way. Without a doubt, it was going to be a large impact on them. And there are studies and people, I think you had strong arguments on either side of that equation showing that it would be a positive for that district as well as Chinatown. And then you had plenty of reason to believe that it would be a negative impact. Who knows where it would actually fall?
Yeah, and I look at and it's funny because one of the things that I'm disappointed. And I think, look, I think at the end of the day, a lot of people won here. In other words, I mean, Comcast is happy because they're going to now share the Sixers and the stadium with the Sixers. The Sixers are happy because now they have 50% control. They're going to have a new place. They're not as much at risk by building that stadium. Now they've got a 50-50 partner. So that's good for them. The Building Trades Council, they're happy because they're going to get to build the stadium. I think, and part of the discussion yesterday was that, Comcast and the Sixers will also try to help redevelop Market East. But the real losers here, I think, is the city of Philadelphia.
Really?
Because I think I have traveled all over the country, and every other major city in this country has figured out how to put a major entertainment complex in the city. Okay? Not the football stadiums mostly, but they have been able to put stadiums, and whether it's New York or Boston or Washington or Miami or Phoenix or Denver, they all have been able to develop either a hockey arena or a basketball arena in the city. And I think when you're a world-class city, in my view, you gotta have something like that in your city. And that the idea of this stadium district, which is an idea. I mean, what Philadelphia says to the rest of the country is we're the only city in the country that has all four sports teams playing within 1 square mile.
Yeah, see, I would take the opposite side of that. I hear you. You look at Madison Square Garden in New York City, right? And that's great. It's right in the middle of the city. People love it. It's world renowned. But they have the public transportation. better than any other city in the United States to be able to handle that. So that's a huge plus for them. And then you can look at examples like what Detroit did, right? And here you're talking about, in both cases, it's where basketball and hockey is played, right? So it's very, very similar to the setup that we were going to potentially have here in Philadelphia. However, I do like the idea. I mean, Philadelphia is a unique city, right? We like to be a little bit different. And having that sports complex with all four major sports teams playing in that area, and then you have the casino that's there, and the fact that, as you mentioned, Comcast is such a massive influence and part of the city, and they own Comcast Spectacor, and they have plans to put hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, into building that area in South Philadelphia out even more, and talking about even putting like massive residential development down there. We could have, the city of Philadelphia could have something that would be unique, not only in the country, but in the world, and be part of making it that world-class city in one of the few areas of this city that actually does have decent subway public transportation to get to and fro.
Okay, I mean that's fair. I mean, look, I get. I mean, I guess part of it is that I worked on when I worked for Governor Ridge, I worked on a baseball stadium that in Center City that got blown up. So I guess I've watched a couple of these sort of efforts to do this fail. But I hear what you're saying, and I suppose I mean the other I guess the other losers in this are tailgaters because as I know, I was at the game on last Sunday. A lot of where people tailgate is going to be where they're building the new stadium, which I think is going to be called the Comcast Center, and because they're going to obviously going to have to build one while they tear the other one down, and then if they're going to have all this other mixed use development, which I think would be cool, you're going to lose parking and you're going to lose tailgating, which again, kind of a unique experience, around not only around the Eagles, but as you and I have experienced, it happens at Phillies games too.
Yeah, and hey, I've seen your tailgate experience. It's pretty solid. It's great. And yes, it will affect tailgaters for a few years. I think the target date is 2031
Right.
for the new stadium to be built, or at least like the area to be developed. There's talk of the stadium being built even before 2031. So it's going to be interesting to see when the stadium actually gets built and what else gets built around it. I still think there's going to be plenty of room for tailgating. Philadelphians are pretty creative. They'll figure out a solution and other ways to make sure that they experience that. And I feel like the sports teams, especially the way that the Sixers and the Roberts family, who've been so much involved in this, they seem to be very in touch with the city and their fans. So I feel like they'll engage with the community to at least figure out some solutions. I hope they do at least. And it's going to be it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. And then if you look at the potential of South Philadelphia and this outcome and everything that just happened, maybe just maybe this is the best case scenario, because now if the city keeps their word, they're going to do the economic development, and so all the promises that they made to Chinatown are still going to happen, even though the stadium's going to be built in South Philly. They're going to keep some of that economic development promises. And now you have a major player as far as the owners of the 76ers and another major player, Comcast Spectacor and Comcast, who is going to be coming to the table with a lot more money and oomph and development, economic development power to build up that South Philly sports arena area in a way that I don't think any other city is going to have. So hopefully that's what actually happens, to be determined. I'm curious what, if anybody listening, if they have some thoughts and views, maybe they can shoot us some emails and comment on it. We'll have some of that information attached to the show. We're curious what everybody else thinks. But yeah, it'll be interesting to say the least.
But I'll tell you, the people who are pissed is city council and the
Yeah.
mayor.
Whether they admit it or not.
I mean, she spent a lot of personal capital getting this deal done. And I would have liked to be a fly on the wall when they called her this week and said, "Hi, Madam Mayor, we got a slight change we want to kind of loop you in on." And I will tell you, I was very impressed with her yesterday, and I listened to most of the press conference. I mean, she was able to take lemons and make it lemonade. In the end, The fact of the matter is that it's probably the right outcome for the city. I agree with you. I think it's probably the right, but I would not want to be anyone who was on the government affairs team for the Sixers get anywhere near City Hall for at least 3 years.
They still have to get some things passed and done as far as what they're going to build in South Philly. So those will be some interesting conversations too.
Because I know from, that nothing you hate more than being lied to. And look, I think they legitimately changed the deal. And I think it was one of those situations where both the principals thought they were going to do what they were going to do, but it turned out differently. So we'll see. And, look, 2031 is only, I don't know, 7 years from now. So 6 years from now.
6 years. I'm sure it'll go by in a flash.
Right. And the other part, I guess the other winner is the WNBA. I think Adam Silver offered up a WNBA franchise to sweeten the pot.
It'll be great if that happens. I think this town would love to have a WNBA team. And I think it'll be well received here and great part of the community. What about the Union playing in that area? Is that ever going to happen? Are they going to stay in Chester forever?
It's an interesting question. Again, where do you put? That stadium is obviously not as big as Lincoln Financial Field. I suppose, could you bring the Union up from Chester and put them there as well? That's an interesting point. I don't know. That's a good question. Then you could have all the sports teams if you count the Union.
Put them all there. Put them all there. Get the Wings there too. Let's do it.
Well, that's what. And there's so we'll see. Look. One thing we know about Philadelphia is we take our sports more seriously than almost anything else. And so conversations about stadiums is sacred to our city. So let's hope, we look back and we go, that was a great decision and everything works out. So,
well, why don't, speaking of 6 years from now, makes me wonder who will be president 6 years from now. We know who the current president is, obviously, and who's going to be the president, at least as far as we can tell, for the next 4 years, all things being equal. That could bring us to President Trump. If you want to get into that topic, or did you want to save that?
Sure. No. So look, I think obviously, one of the things about the new Trump administration is it will begin and it will end in 4 years. Despite what people say that, oh no, he'll make it so he can run again, I'm pretty confident that the biggest guardrails, like texts in the Constitution of the United States, will make it that he's a one-term president. And I'm sure even for him, I think he will be ready to get some stuff done, and then I think he'll be ready to get back to the rest of his life. Look, one of the things that he's accomplished just by getting elected, as today was the day that Jack Smith released his report, was he got a get out of jail free card by pulling off a big political victory that ran him smack dab into the Justice Department guidelines that says, oops, I can't prosecute that guy anymore because he's about to be president of the United States. So I give him credit for running. I give him credit for winning. And he's pretty much free of his criminal issues that, frankly, I think were pretty serious.
Yeah, there's so much to think about and talk about. We're recording this on January 14th, and we're just days away from the inauguration. I think it's the same theme continues to be played out that we've seen over the last several years, where half the country is incredibly excited for the new administration to come in, and another half of the country is terrified and fearful of all sorts of things. And hopefully we find some middle ground where not only the country can come together as far as just the populace in general, emotionally, because you've certainly seen that played out and represented in the stock market the last few weeks. But it'd be great to see Congress and some legislation passed that has a little bit more middle ground, and Congress be able to find a middle ground. I think we've started to see some factions develop even within both parties, within the Democratic side and within the Republican side, as the power starts to shift around and move a little bit. Elon Musk has certainly played a significant role, a tremendous role. And I think anybody who's on the left, there's a just sort of general dislike and disdain for some of Elon. So he's managed to get half the country to not really like him so much. And then even within the Republican camp, you're really starting to see a little bit of a divide where there's, at least from what I'm seeing, there's starting, it seems like there's a growing divide of even Republicans who are starting to kind of get put off by Elon. And the recent news we saw of, maybe Elon's even going to be the potential acquirer purchaser of TikTok,
Right.
which who knows where that's going to land, but if that happens, it'll certainly blow up his influence in a louder way. Not blow it up in a way where it will diminish it. Blow it up as in expand it and multiply it, magnify it. In orders of magnitude.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's interesting. Read something the other day that there's a kind of a division forming between Steve Bannon and Elon Musk, and it'll be interesting to see. I look. So here's how for those part of the country that's fearful of what's about to come, the way I've sort of explained it to people, including my own grown-up kids, is let's focus on what he's doing and not what he's saying. And I think this last week was a good example where we
So he's
talked
not
about.
invading Greenland. He's not.
Yeah, like right, like the Greenland, Panama, Canada moment. And it's interesting because I think yet again the mainstream news media just hook, line, and sinker goes, well, what do you mean? You can't just buy you just can't, buy Greenland, and you can't just buy Panama, you can't attack them. And I think the answer is that what we've learned about Donald Trump from having him as president for 4 years is he's a businessman and a negotiator. So I think there is truth to the fact that he puts maximalist positions on the table.
Hmm.
I'm going to invade. I'm going to invade Greenland, a territory of our NATO ally Denmark. Now that's ridiculous. Okay, and at some point you have to say, yeah, it's ridiculous. I get it. You want some involvement in Greenland, and so it becomes a negotiating point. It's not a great way, I think, it's never a great way to do foreign policy. And I think part of the problem with Donald Trump is, we have yet again a real estate developer as our president, or about to be our president, and that's the way he does the art of the deal.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you there, and I think it's going to be fascinating to see how history judges these moments. And obviously, we know the big moments that are going to stand out from history. When you talk about history judging Trump, whether it's during his first campaign, the time between his first campaign and his now second presidency, everybody immediately thinks of January 6th as one of the exclamation points there as far as what history's going to judge. But if outside of that, and when we're far removed from his presidency, and less emotions are involved, I think he's going to be seen as a master of theatrics, as part of his what he calls the art of the deal, and from the title of his book and the way he negotiates. And I think there's going to be a little bit of chuckling and snickering when people are going to say, I can't believe he kept fooling them with the same routine, the same tactic over and over again, where if he wants to land in the middle of the field, there's no way he starts with that as a negotiating point. He expands the goalposts so much to say, well, I'm going to invade Greenland, and we might take over the Panama Canal too. And if that becomes the initial point of negotiation, well, and then you land far away from that, that's probably what he was hoping to already get anyway. Maybe I'm giving him too much credit. Maybe I'm saying he's this master negotiator and has an amazing way to kind of set up the chessboard and then move the pieces around. Maybe I'm giving him too much credit, but I feel like we've seen that tactic done so many times, and then the result ultimately land where maybe he already wanted it anyway. I hope we would never invade Greenland. I don't see how that's even possible.
Right. Well, yeah, I no, it's interesting. I mean, and I think, one of the things about when you look at history, we last week, America buried Jimmy Carter. And, it's very interesting when presidents die, we have this moment where the country appropriately reflects on the legacy of a president's career. And
Yeah, yeah.
interestingly enough, I think we saw this both with Gerald Ford, who only served president for a few years, and Jimmy Carter, that you suddenly kind of appreciate some of the things that they actually did and got done that in fact mattered.
So what sticks out the most to you with Carter's legacy?
Well, with Carter, it's interesting. So a couple of things. First of all, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel has withstood 45 years of complete upheaval in the Middle East, but that relationship between Egypt and Israel has remained strong. In other words, so that
It got
anchor,
one leader killed, right?
well, it did. I mean, that's it got one leader killed. So I think that was something that's very important. You look at. I also think that President Carter did a lot of deregulation in the 70s. So the reason that we have low cost airlines, or the reason that we have relatively inexpensive airlines, is because he deregulated the airline industry in the 70s. And so a lot of what he did has kind of affected people going forward. And what I found, obviously, the other part about Jimmy Carter is just that he was a decent person, that character mattered. And it was really interesting, to see the five presidents sitting there. And they can't help but think when they sit in that room that someday there's going to be four of them, and somebody's in the box in the front and the other four are watching. And like, what will people say about them? And I think if you're Jimmy Carter, you felt like, the world sort of ultimately got you. And I think his aide, one of the people who gave the eulogies, Stuart Eisenstadt, said something very interesting. He says, while I acknowledge that Jimmy Carter does not belong on Mount Rushmore, he probably lands somewhere in the foothills.
I like that.
And I thought that was a really good line.
That's a great way to sum it up. It is a great line.
And it's like presidents make, yeah. So I think, and so look, yeah, good.
It's interesting, right? Because I think collectively, I can, definitely I can speak for myself as an individual, but I think collectively, we as a country, the people of the country, have a tendency to give presidents too much credit for the way things are when they're in office, and not give them enough credit for some of the policies that they put into place, that we don't really see the outcomes or the benefits, for better or worse, until they're out of office. And you really, I think, touched on something that we can look at Carter's legacy, where Reagan really benefited from some of the policies that he put in place, or some of the strategies that were initiated when he was in office, that either played out and we saw some really positive benefits from with presidents like Reagan, or Reagan just doubled down on, that really helped. And like two of them that come to mind, you already hit on one, which was some of the deregulation, and and then that turned into Reaganomics, right? And Reaganomics, I mean, it bears his name, and it's something that Republicans mention to this day as far as positive ways to impact the economy. So you have that. And then I think another one that's really lesser known is it was under the Carter administration where the U.S. really started to fund some of the efforts with the Taliban in Afghanistan. And, with a significant fear, because if you think about what was going on with the Cold War at the time, and there was just this huge fear of what Russia was going to be able to accomplish in Afghanistan, and the only way to fight it was to start arming and uniting the faction Taliban tribes that were all over Afghanistan. And that's something that really initiated under the Carter regime, and then was only doubled and tripled down on with Reagan and future presidents.
And it was,
sure, we can certainly argue the pros and cons of that, right? Because then we all know what the Taliban turned into.
Right.
But ultimately, if you look at that period of time, it was the beginning of the bankrupting and the collapse of the Soviet Union. That first domino was tipped under the Carter administration. So from that perspective, as far as just looking at it through the lens of how it impacted the Soviet Union and the Cold War, very positive. If you expand out and you say, well, how did it impact the greater Middle East and the Taliban's role in that region overall, well, then, we kind of we would judge it a little differently and say maybe not the best idea, or maybe a good idea, but we could have been a little bit more thoughtful about how it was done.
Right. And I think in some ways, President Carter spoke truth to power about the Palestinian issue. That obviously continues to be a problem and obviously became more complicated after October 7th, where he's really saying something that was very unpopular, which is we really got to fix that problem has to be fixed. And it's interesting. I mentioned the Taliban, so it was then when they started, they had ended the draft after Vietnam, but they had started registration again when the Russians went into Afghanistan. And I was actually, at the time, 18 years old and had to register for selective service. You had to go when you turned 18.
Careful,
you had to
you're
go to,
letting people know how old you are now, Eric.
That's okay. I'm proud of the gray hair I've grown, but it's just a funny thing. I mean, the other part about Jimmy Carter for me is, now that I've outed myself, Jimmy Carter was the president during my 4 years of high school. Mm. And he was my first vote. In other words, I voted.
Those are formative years. Those are formative years, right?
No, and it was my first vote. My first election was the 1980 presidential election, and I voted for Jimmy Carter. Didn't work.
Yeah. Was it Napoleon who said, "Show me who was the leader around when somebody was 20, and I'll tell you how they think and the biggest impact on their life"? I'll check that while we're talking about some other topics. But I do want to pause for a second because this would be one of the moments in the show where I would be swirling a glass of Pinot Noir, sniffing it. I'm going to pretend that I have a Pinot from Willamette Valley in my glass. Maybe something from the city of Clarkston. Probably, what would I be drinking? Let's just say it's like a 2017 Pinot, Willamette Valley, and something that is really bright in my glass right now. Some raspberry cherry notes, and just is absolutely delicious. I'm taking my first sip, and I'm telling everyone about how great it is. So.
Well, for those of us who are not doing dry January, let me recommend a trip to your, for those of you who are in Pennsylvania, a trip to your wine and spirit shop. As many of you know, Pennsylvania is one of the few states in the entire country that still completely controls the Liquor Control Board and all the liquor distribution. But what they have done, and they started it years ago when I was in the Ridge administration, was kind of the chairman's selection program. And what they basically figured out is, look, if we're not going to privatize this, we are the largest wine buyer in the world because we have literally thousands of stores. And so what it's enabled them to do is buy good wine at a discount. But the trick to it, and here's my wine tip for Pinot and Policy, is, look, don't just look at the differential between the retail price and the price, or the actual retail price and the price you're selling it for. Look to see which have independent ratings. Because what you'll see when you go is you'll see, 90 points from Wine Spectator or 91 points from Wine Enthusiast. The trick is pick a dollar amount you want to spend and then find independent reviews. Because what you do discover is the other part of that program is they buy wine from well-known winemakers that they know isn't very good. And so they're willing to discount it in a way that's ridiculous. So stay away from those. It used to be 85 and now it's 15 unless there's an independent wine review.
And I did take that time to find that quote. In order to understand someone, you need to look at the world when they were 20 years old. Napoleon experienced the French Revolution when he was about 20 years old. So that kind of makes sense. He was a Corsican nationalist. So appreciate the time to find that, Eric. I'm trying to see if it was actually Napoleon who said that. But that transitions us to our next topic, which is
the wildfires in LA,
which are just god awful.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like, the analogy here in the Philadelphia area is if Gladwin and Villanova that's up on a hill, just incinerated. It's just terrible to see. Rafe, I know you've been to LA a bit, and I've been to LA a bit. I mean, it's a beautiful area, but you see the problem. You see, where people live, and you see the mountains, and it's gorgeous, but you see it's just a disaster waiting to happen. And, what upsets me, I mean, I guess there's two things. One, obviously, just, the human suffering, the idea that, you know, you had a house today and your house was gone tomorrow. It just, as somebody who lives in a house that he grew up in, I'd be one of those stories of people that, my father bought a house 50 years ago and I was raised in it and I raised my kids in it and now it's all gone. You just you just feel your heart breaks for the people. And you know that in LA, home ownership's very pricey. A lot of people, spent their whole life savings to be able to buy houses like that. And they're not all big houses. I mean, and even some of the nicest neighborhoods, they're obviously tear downs and big houses, but they're also small houses that have been in generations. It's really sad.
I mean, it's awful. And then we're seeing, like all things in this country, it's highly politicized. Lots of finger pointing. When things like this happen, and we're all emotional creatures, and like you run the gamut of emotions, and anger being one of them, and wanting to blame somebody to direct that anger, it's easy to go there right away. Republicans who want to latch on to Republican issues and use them as the boogeyman, and there are Democrats who want to latch on to Democrat issues and use them as the boogeyman. And the reality is they're probably both right with things that we can do better, right? Like at some point, we're going to look at these fires and say, obviously, how can we avoid doing this again in the future? How can we make sure that this never happens again, or at least the possibility of it happening again is extremely mitigated? So while yes, I totally agree, we need to be analyzing and looking at ways to prevent this. But to be using it as a way to point fingers and demonize people, that to me is just nauseating and sickening and just not the time to be doing it. So I'm hoping both sides of the party figure out ways to get better. And like, I mean, you can just review them in no particular order and not trying to highlight one more than the other. But obviously, we need to figure out a way if mass events like this are going to happen, large events like large catastrophic events like this are going to happen potentially on a continuing basis because of climate change, then we do need to figure out ways. Well, we should have maybe more access to water from our reservoirs. We should have, a fire hydrant system that is able to tap into deeper wells of water. And maybe we do need to consider cleaning forest floors and figuring out ways to do controlled fires or at least clean our forests. But at the same time, we need to accept the fact that there is a mental health crisis in this country and in a lot of urban cities. And if we don't address that crisis, there are going to be things like arson, which occur from time to time. And those are just some of the few charged topics that are being thrown around right now. If we address one of them, is that a silver bullet? No. But if we address all of them, maybe we can prevent something like this from happening again.
Right. And then the answer is you do that, but not while the fires are still burning.
No.
It's
everything into putting the fires out.
It's so emblematic of the problem we have in our country. And is that there has to be a partisan. I mean, what can't be partisan? In other words, I mean, like, the pandemic that became partisan. These wildfires became partisan. And I just think it's something where Americans have to look in the mirror and say, we got to stop. We got to stop. We got real problems and we got to figure out how to solve them. And not to plug for what you and I worked on, in 2024.
Plug away, baby.
You and I were, leading an effort for the Forward Party that is a national movement to say, we've got these problems, we've got to solve them. We understand that people take a different view of different things, but we can agree that wildfires are not a good thing. So how do we fix that? And, I agree with you. Look, climate change is, I mean, let's agree that the climate is changing. The reason those fires were happening is because it was unusually dry in the LA area. The Santa Ana winds happen all the time.
Right.
Okay. And it may be the Santa Ana winds are worse than they have been because of, higher and lower pressures, which create that wind. Right. And, can you, and, the fire department, the head of the fire department said, listen, there are not enough fire trucks in all of California to put out the number of fires we had at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Resources were
it,
just strained. Insurance companies are going to have to figure out better ways to serve their communities, right? Like there are a lot of things that we as a country need to figure out that sadly the pattern here, the history in our country and other countries too, but we have this tendency to kick the can on contentious issues uh, until there's a catastrophic event, right? Until we don't really look at issues in the eye until somebody, like not only just slaps us in the face with it, it's like we need a sledgehammer coming down on our toe while we're getting slapped and punched in the face at the same time, right? Like so the as tragic as this event is, the hope is after we get through it, we figure out a better way to not only mitigate these fires, but to deal with climate change issues, all sorts of climate change issues. And I'm not arguing what is causing climate change. I think we all agree there's climate change, whether it's man-made or not, that we have to deal with these climate change issues. And insurance companies are going to have to figure out a way to be accountable to states and their customers.
I mean, frankly, the truth is that what you're going to see is insurance companies are going to walk away. I mean, they're going to have to pay. They're going to have to, if you have a covered loss, they're going to cover this loss. And obviously, the California wildfires will be a, tens of billion-dollar loss for the insurance industry. But what's going to happen, because I've worked in the insurance industry, they're going to say, we're done. And frankly, it's going to be up to government to create some sort of a state-funded insurance program, because these companies, look, at the end of the day, an insurance company is built on the premise that all of us pay in and only some of us take out.
Well, isn't there, and I don't have the details on it, but I know a lot of policies were, kind of just terminated by the insurance companies only months before these fires came because of, and it's not like they had a crystal ball and they
Right,
knew
because of other fires, because
right?
of other, right.
It's, it's because of the way that, and I think California of all states probably has some of the most red tape and bureaucracy to get any kind of changes done when it comes to big corporations like this. But with inflation, with climate change, both of those, among other variables that are pushing premiums up on insurance policies, these companies aren't able to adapt and pivot with those changing macroeconomic headwinds that they're facing. And yes, obviously these companies are all making money, and there's a strong argument to say, well, they should just, be taking care of people. I'm not trying to get into that kind of a discussion.
Right.
That's a different type of conversation. But if they have certain formulas for them to do business, and they are forced, as you said, to essentially walk away from a state or customers because the government isn't moving fast enough with those macroeconomic events that are going on, then that's a problem, right? So that needs to be addressed not only in California, but in plenty of other states throughout the country. And this is an issue that really started coming from 2020 during COVID.
Right.
This
right.
is now it's just kind of being magnified because of these awful fires. But this has been going on in states, and housing insurance is an issue in Florida, is going to continue to be. People can't afford to stay in their houses because of the insurance, or they are just going without insurance.
Right.
So I think this is a topic that we will probably come back to, because I think it's really interesting. And Eric, you've got a unique background with it. So I'm really curious to see maybe what are some of the solutions that you would recommend, not only for California, but for other parts of the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think at the end of the day, you've got to find a way to reduce the risk so that the risk becomes insurable. And it really is tough. And so, as we sort of wrap up today's episode of Pinot and Policy, I just send out our hearts to the people of LA. We're hoping that the fires come quickly to an end. And look, rebuilding, Rafe, you have experience with contracting projects. Imagine if the entire, they want to rebuild. Assume for a minute they've got the money to rebuild. There aren't contractors to help them in a reasonable amount of time. And by the time we do this again, the Trump administration will have started and they will have deported all illegal aliens. So there'll be no one left to work.
Well, that's a nice hook to end the show on. But I mean, this is probably a 10-year project to rebuild LA. Maybe a decent comparison might be the fire of Notre Dame, which was a much smaller but certainly a horrific event for people to see.
Right.
What the symbolism, what that represented, obviously not leaving tens of thousands of people homeless and watching, their memories and their life savings go up in flames. But I just bring that comparison up because initially it was thought that it might take at least 10 years to rebuild the cathedral. And I think it was done in 7 years?
Yeah, 6.
6 years.
Yeah.
Hopefully that is an inspirational kind of image for people to hold on to, and hopefully the 10-year rebuild in LA can be done in a shorter period of time and be close to half as Notre Dame was, and hopefully it's done better just like Notre Dame Cathedral was, and this is something that can be built on for people. Anybody I talk to knows someone directly that has been touched by this, and I couldn't imagine being on the ground, even just besides the people that have had the worst of it, the people that are breathing in the smoke and also awful health effects from that going on, the fear of knowing or of wondering, is the fire going to be coming to my neighborhood next? It's just awful.
Yeah, it's very painful. And I too have friends who have both lost their houses and haven't lost their houses, but are worried. We're thinking about those folks. We were happy to see the Rams win last night, but we don't want them to win next week as they take on the Philadelphia Eagles in the divisional playoffs.
Go Birds.
So with that, I thank you for joining us on our first episode of Pinot and Policy. I want to thank my co-host, Rafe.
My pleasure, Eric.
And we'll see everybody next time.